Welcome to Mr. Hutchings History, where the past comes alive. Let's dive into today's story.
Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're exploring a fascinating chapter in history, the Cold War arms and space race leading up to 1959. You sent us some fascinating stuff to delve into, including excerpts from a podcast episode about this very topic. And as we'll see, the Cold War, well, it was about a lot more than just, military might. It was about psychology and ideology and some very close calls.
Nodding.
Yeah, at the heart of it all was this intense rivalry between the US and the Soviet Union. And it's incredible how much of this rivalry, when you really look at it, was fueled by perception rather than reality.
The classic case, really, of how miscalculations and assumptions, can escalate tensions. Both sides were working with limited information. It led them to plan for, well, really the worst case scenarios.
Yeah, it's like playing a dangerous game of telephone, but on like a global scale. And that fear, as you can imagine, had a massive ripple effect. One example is Eisenhower's Open Skies proposal back in 1955. Now, this was a time when tensions were incredibly high, but this proposal on the surface seemed, well, at least reasonable mutual aerial surveillance, to try and foster some kind of trust and prevent surprises.
Right, a pretty elegant solution on the surface.
Exactly. You'd think everyone would have been on board with that, but Khrushchev just rejected it outright. What was going on there?
Well, I think we have to look at the state of things at the time. The Soviets were lagging behind in some pretty key technological areas, and they were very wary of revealing those vulnerabilities to the U.S. Khrushchev's rejection was a way to project an image of strength, even if it was something of a facade.
So it was all about saving face on the world stage, but this whole thing with perception versus reality, and well, it had some very real consequences. And a perfect example of this is the whole missile gap idea that gripped the U.S.
The missile gap is a prime example of how perception became reality during the Cold War. The U.S. was convinced, that the Soviets had a much larger nuclear arsenal than they actually did. And that fear, that perceived threat, it fueled so much anxiety and drove military spending through the roof.
And to think all that fear was based on, well, what those U-2 spy planes ultimately revealed to be inaccurate information.
Exactly. Those U-2 flights ended up exposing the truth, which was that the U.S. actually had the upper hand in terms of nuclear capabilities. And this presented Eisenhower with a really tricky dilemma.
Okay, so let's unpack this for a second. You've got this situation where you discover that your biggest fear, it's essentially unfounded. But then revealing the truth, well, that could escalate things even further. What do you do?
It's a tough spot to be in. Going public, might have eased some anxieties, at least domestically, but it also carried this risk of intensifying the arms race even more. Staying silent, on the other hand, well, that meant facing criticism at home for seemingly falling behind in the arms race.
It really highlights just how much psychology and perception factored into every single aspect of the Cold War.
Absolutely. Even if the U.S. knew they were ahead in the arms race, the Soviets didn't. And it's that uncertainty, the not knowing about each other's capabilities, that really fueled a lot of the actions on both sides. And then in 1957, something happened that truly shook the U.S. to its core, the launch of Sputnik.
October 4th, 1957, a date etched in history. And it wasn't just a satellite, it was a symbol of Soviet capability, right?
It was a major, and I mean a major propaganda victory for the Soviets. It wasn't simply about, launching a hunk of metal into space. It was about demonstrating their technological prowess to the rest of the world, and it worked. Sputnik terrified people in the U.S. It fueled fears about Soviet capabilities, about the possibility of, space-based weapons.
So what was the response from the U.S.? How did they react?
Well, the U.S. went into overdrive trying to catch up. Sputnik sent shockwaves through the nation. And it eventually led to some pretty significant developments. I mean, you have the creation of NASA in 1958, and this renewed focus on science education in the U.S. with the National Defense Education Act.
It's amazing how this one seemingly small event could have such a huge impact.
It really underscores the power of symbols, especially in a climate as tense and charged as the Cold War. The space race, it wasn't just about scientific achievement. It was about national pride, about ideological dominance, about proving that your system, your way of life, was superior.
And this whole struggle for dominance, it played out in some pretty interesting ways, even in seemingly, well, mundane encounters, like, for instance, in 1959 when Khrushchev visited the U.S. and got into that now infamous kitchen debate with Nixon.
Right. It might seem like a strange footnote in history, two world leaders arguing over kitchen appliances. But, that impromptu debate speaks volumes about the deeper ideological clash that was at the very heart of the Cold War.
On the surface, you have this, well, I guess, casual exchange about consumer goods. But what was the real story there?
Well, Khrushchev was using this as a way to really highlight the advancements that the Soviets had made. Once again, pointing to Sputnik as proof that the communist system could produce these technological marvels. And he wanted to drive home this idea that, their system was every bit as good, if not better, than, the American system.
So how did Nixon counter that? How did she respond?
Well, Nixon really focused on the strengths of the American capitalist system. He kept bringing it back to the availability of consumer goods, the higher standard of living that people enjoyed in the U.S., presenting it as this more desirable, more attainable way of life.
So it was kind of like this microcosm of the broader ideological struggle, this really complex dynamic playing out on the world stage, but in this very sort of like domestic setting. It's an interesting contrast.
Absolutely, and it highlights how the Cold War, it wasn't just fought with weapons and espionage and all of that. It was also a battle for hearts and minds, a competition for global influence on a very fundamental level.
It's almost like they were competing for the soul of the world in a way.
In a way, yes. And this battle of ideologies, it's fascinating because on one hand, you have this tense standoff, right? But on the other, you have these moments like the Camp David Summit in 1959 that, at least for a little while, hinted at a possible thaw in relations.
Right. Was that a genuine attempt at peace, or was it more strategic? Was it just a way for both sides to kind of like catch their breath?
It's a tough question, and there's no easy answer. The Camp David talks, they did mark this noticeable shift in tone. For a short period, it seemed like Eisenhower and Khrushchev, they might actually find some common ground, particularly on things like arms control and, just generally trying to de-escalate tensions. They even called it the spirit of Camp David.
Which, sounds promising on the surface, but we know that, unfortunately, that spirit didn't last.
No, it didn't. And in a way, the incident that really brought this hopeful period to a crashing halt takes us back to those U-2 spy planes. In a way, those flights embody the push and pull of the entire Cold War. You have these attempts at diplomacy, this hope for something better, but then you have suspicion and, well, espionage, rear their ugly heads and sabotage any progress that might have been made. And so, just as the superpowers are gearing up for this big summit in Paris, a U-2 piloted by Francis Gary Powers gets shot down over Soviet territory, May of 1960.
Talk about bad timing.
It was a major, major setback. And Khrushchev, well, you can't blame him for feeling betrayed. He accused the U.S. of hypocrisy, especially after Eisenhower had made these assurances that the U-2 flights would stop.
So much for building trust and goodwill.
Right.
Wow.
And the Paris summit, well, that collapsed before it even really began. And that very fragile thaw in U.S.-Soviet relations gone, just like that.
It feels like a real turning point. This moment where the hope of Camp David gives way to this renewed sense of suspicion and distrust. Looking back, who was more at fault? Was it the U.S. for continuing those flights, or was it the Soviets, for overreacting?
It's a debate that continues to this day. And there are different schools of thought among historians when they analyze these sorts of events. The traditional view, what's often referred to as the Orthodox view, tends to put more of the blame on the Soviets. The argument being that it was their inherent paranoia, their insecurities about the West, that fueled the entire crisis.
So they may have overreacted, at least to some degree.
That's the Orthodox interpretation, but more recent scholarship, what we call the revisionist view, suggests that the U.S., well, they have to share at least some of the blame. After all, they knew how the Soviets would react, yet they went ahead with the U-2 flights anyway. And that decision, that choice, it certainly played a role in reigniting those Cold War tensions.
It just goes to show that even with, I guess, good intentions, miscommunication and this lack of trust can have huge consequences. And just to complicate matters even further, it turns out that, well, the U.S. had the upper hand in nuclear weapons this whole time.
And this is where Robert McNamara's role becomes really interesting. See, when he became Secretary of Defense under Kennedy in 1961, one of the first things he discovers is that this whole missile gap idea, this thing that had caused so much anxiety and driven so much policy in the U.S., well, it was basically a myth.
You're kidding. All that fear, all that spending, all based on what turned out to be faulty information.
It really highlights the danger of misinformation and how easily fear can be manipulated, even at the highest levels of government. But, and this is important, even though the U.S. had a larger arsenal, the Soviets, they were catching up. And they were catching up fast.
So the pressure was still on.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
The Soviets were determined to reach parity with the U.S., and they were making huge strides in areas like intermediate-range missiles and, as we talked about earlier, space technology.
So the Cold War was far from over.
It might even be more accurate to say that it was evolving. It was becoming less about brute military force and more about technological innovation, psychological warfare, this constant need to project an image of strength and superiority, even if, the reality on the ground was far more complicated.
It was like this high-stakes chess match playing out on a global scale, with each side trying to outmaneuver the other. Every technological advancement, every public statement, every action, it was all a calculated move.
That's a great way to put it. The Cold War, it was this complex game of strategy, perception, and I think it's safe to say often misperception as well. And here's the thing, even though the Soviet Union itself is gone, the game, in a lot of ways, isn't over.
What do you mean? I mean, it's like we're still living in the shadow of that conflict, even though the world on the surface, it looks so different now.
Exactly. And I think that's why it's so important, to really understand this period of history, not just as, a bunch of names and dates, but as this, as this kind of cautionary tale.
A cautionary tale about, well, for sure, about the dangers of unchecked fear, but also about how important communication and clear thinking really are. It's something we always try to emphasize here on the deep dive. So, like, what does this all actually mean for us today? What are some of the, I guess, key takeaways from this deep dive into the Cold War tech race?
Well, I think it really all comes down to critical thinking. It's more important than ever in today's world where, information, whether it's true or not, spreads so quickly. We can't just take everything at face value anymore. We have to be willing to, dig a little deeper, to question things and consider like a wider range of perspectives.
Especially with, the way news works now, it's a 24/7 cycle, and it's so easy to just get swept up in the headlines and the narratives that are being spun. But like we saw with that whole missile gap thing, even things that seem certain, well, they can be based on incomplete information or just flat out wrong information.
Right. And that's why we can't underestimate the power of just, one person asking the right questions. Just like those crucial moments we talked about during the Cold War, where one decision, one technological breakthrough could shift the balance of power.
It makes you realize that our voices, the choices we make, they really do matter.
They absolutely do. I mean, we may not all be world leaders negotiating treaties, but we can all strive to be, informed citizens. We can engage with each other, challenge assumptions, and work toward, a better future.
Yeah. It's a good reminder that just because something happened a certain way in the past, that doesn't mean it's inevitable in the future. Maybe by understanding those mistakes and those missed opportunities of the past, well, maybe we can find a better path.
I'd like to think so.
Well, listener, we have definitely covered a lot of ground in this deep dive into the Cold War tech race. It was a period filled with incredible advancements, those really intense rivalries, and definitely a few moments where things could have gone very differently.
It's a great reminder that history is rarely simple or straightforward. There are always different sides to every story, hidden motives, unintended consequences. And that complexity, that's part of what makes studying this era so fascinating and so relevant even now.
It definitely gives us a lot to think about. So we want to hear from you, listener. What surprised you? What resonated with you during this deep dive into the Cold War? Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep diving deeper.
Thanks for listening to Mr. Hutchings History. Keep exploring, and we'll see you next time.